Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. So this month we are making this scrap overload quilt block. This is an incredible scrappy journey. Lots and lots of little pieces, but it's going to be so much fun to put together. And my favorite part is this super scrappy border. So let's jump on the machine and learn how to piece this scrap overload block together. So the first step of the scrap overload block is to lay out a quarter of the block. And this is one of those things that can be a little tricky because it's asymmetrical. So just be really careful, refer to your pattern, make sure everything is correct. You're supposed to have a little diamond, kind of it looks like it's on point, made from the half square triangles. You're supposed to have this angle created with your background triangles, and again another angle right here. So there's areas that you can kind of check yourself and make sure that you're on the right track, but it really helps to just slow down, take your time, and refer to the diagrams in your pattern. Okay, so once you get it laid out and you're sure it's correct, then we're going to follow the same path we've done with all of the blocks, and that is to flip and clip. I flip over, put in a clip, grab the next piece, flip it over, and clip all of the units together in one row. And this is so when I get to my machine, I know exactly how this is going to go together, and I'm not flipping things around the wrong way. I'm not accidentally taking that and turning it that way, which would definitely be wrong. So you want to make sure that you stay on track and get all of your rows clipped together properly. So I'm going to take a minute to do this, and then I'll meet you at the machine as we begin sewing these units together. So I'm here on my machine. I want to make sure I am stitching with the straight stitch, needle in the center position, and I've dialed my stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. And this is to produce a nice tight stitch, and that's going to lock the pieces together perfectly. Okay, so I stitched through a scrap charger. That's just a doubled up piece of fabric, and that helps to lift my foot up to the right surface, to the right height for these pieces to slip under. And it also ensures that, all those long thread tails, if it's going to get sucked down into the machine, then that's going to happen on that scrap rather than on my actual pieces of my block. So now I'm going to line this up. I'm working on the very first pieces that go together. And you want to look at half square triangles where you have seam allowance. I want to lead with that. So if this was flipped around the other way, actually I realized I've got seam allowance on both sides, so it honestly doesn't matter in this particular case. But if I had only seam allowance on one piece, I'd want to make sure that that's leading, that's at the start. And the reason being, when you hit the seam allowance with your foot, it can push the pieces down ever so slightly. So I kind of like to put them in jail, and I do that by stitching through that first. Very first thing I stitch through always. Okay, so now I'm going to grab another scrap charger. So once I stitch down and off of those pieces, then I just grab the next row, and this is just a process of chain piecing. And here's a situation like I was just talking about. I've got the seam allowance coming down, and it's only on one of my pieces, not on both. So in this case, I want to turn this around like this, so that way the edge, the corner with the seam allowance goes first. And when I say putting something in jail, what I mean is I'm going to push this right up against my needle, and my needle's in the down position, so that the very next stitch I take is going to be right onto those pieces. So I lift the foot, I push the fabrics right up against the needle, I make sure that that edge is lined up right up against the foot too, and then begin stitching. And that ensures that that area of bulky seam allowance is not going to slip downward. It's going to be stitched and nice and secure, and those pieces are going to go together super accurately. So I'm just going to continue sewing all of the rows together just like so, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to sew them together to create a quarter of the block. So I have my first two rows here. I'm just going to take a second, make sure that those corners are lined up perfectly this way and along the side. That looks good. I'll slip them underneath the foot, right up against the needle, and begin stitching. Now I decided not to pin this because I'm trusting my fabric preparation and cutting. So basically, instead of pinning, I just flip up on that seam, stack them on top of one another, and then put a good bit of fingertip pressure down on that seam as it goes through the machine, just like so. All right, line that one up. Now, I have been noticing that these bulky seams sometimes get a little caught, so I just take my hand, put it back, and just give it a little bit of a tug, not a lot, just a little bit of pressure on that back can help it guide and stitch over it. If you start to run into bulky seams, that might be something that helps you out too. Here we go, lining that up. And just that gentle fingertip pressure I find is often all I need to keep those seams stacked on top of one another nicely. There we go. And then the most careful thing is just making sure that those corners come out right too. And unfortunately, that's double stacked seam allowance. I got seam allowance there and seam allowance there. So I want to just be really careful as I stitch all the way down and over that corner. So that's how I'm going to piece all of the rows together. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished piecing a quarter of this block. So here we go. These are the 4 quarters of our quilt block, and you can see how they go together to create this beautiful diamond pattern. And the most important seams to match are the seams right here in these diamonds. And as long as those match, pretty much you can get away with everything else. So I wouldn't really worry so much when you're in the background sections, because that's, it's background on background. It's really going to blend in. It's mostly just focusing on those seams right there in the centers that's going to catch the eye if they're off a little bit. So what you're going to do is just piece that together in sets of 2, and then piece the 2 sets together, and that's the center of your block finished. And now, like I said, this is a scrap overload, so we're going to add even more scraps in the border, and this is a nice little long strips that are going to extend all the way out to the outer edges of the block. We're not actually going to piece on any extra black strips to this block. And one thing, just in case this border does not fit onto your center square, go back and watch the piecing video for block 4, and you'll see how I added extra length to those strips on the end. In this case, I would just simply add an extra scrappy strip to the end, because that's not going to really be noticeable if it doesn't come out exactly the right size. So I think that's A-okay. And in this case, the reason why this isn't fitting quite right is I haven't sewn that seam yet. So of course it's a 1/2 inch bigger than it should be. And I've got these long, super long scrappy strips for both sides. So there we go. That is how this block is going to go together. Really, the key is just getting quarter of the block pieced correctly, and then everything else is going to fall into place. So that's it for this video. This is one pretty intense block. So my best advice is to get started immediately, start cutting up your units because there's a lot of cutting involved, and start piecing up your 1/2 square triangles. Once you get all of your units created and the borders pieced, it does go together quite quickly. But break it into smaller units so that way you can knock it out in chunks, and that way you won't fall behind. Now, if you'd like to join in the fun and make the Friendship Sampler Quilt with me, come and find all of the quilt patterns and the tutorials I've shared so far at leahday.com/friendship. And just in case you're worrying about getting started late, don't worry at all. All of my tutorials and videos will stay online forever, so you can join in the fun anytime and work at your own pace. So come and pick up your patterns and get started today at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.